Welcome back, AP. All right, so welcome to about 6:45 in the morning. Actually, on my board it says 5:58 because that clock's wrong. But that would be even more disturbing if I was here at 5:58 in the morning to record your flip. But it is early in the morning, right? But we are going to attack right where we left off in class. And where we left off in class, we were talking about the appeal of Protestant thought, right? Why is Protestantism spreading so quickly, right? And we kind of tackled some of these ideas of like Zwingli versus Luther's ideas versus Catholic Church's ideas and transubstantiation. We discussed how it's kind of a myth that, we discussed how it's kind of a myth that, that Protestantism only appealed to the poor, right? Discussed that, and we really dived deep into Protestant thought. We talked about how Protestant thought just had a lot of appeal to a lot of the people in Europe at the time. Like, for example, Protestant thought is a lot less complicated, right? It's a lot less complicated. It's much easier to understand. So this works and does make it more appealing for the poor, but it also makes it more appealing for nobles, right? So there's less ceremony and a lot more faith, right? Again, makes it appealing to both classes very, very highly. Vernacular Bibles is going to be another one of the hugest parts of the appeal of the Protestant faith, with this idea of go off and read everything on your own and like actually interpret the Bible for yourself, which is going to turn a lot of monks from the Catholic faith. And they're going to be like, wait a minute, you mean I don't have to sit in a dark room anymore and just copy mindlessly from one Latin book to the other? Madeline Collins, look at you, all knowing stuff all the time. Also, again, really quick, before we go any further, shout out to two people today. Shout out Emma Dewey, who was practicing her Albert IOs in S period and showed them to me. She got 9 out of 11 correct. She's going to be ready to crush that quiz tomorrow. And then shout out to Morgan Hutchinson for showing us how to make it so you can practice those Albert IOs without me actually even necessarily having to be the one that assigns them to you, right? So, heck yeah, let's go. All right, so now, big thing, though, going forward also. So these vernacular Bibles are going to turn a heavy amount of people away from the Catholic faith. And as we know, because of Malaya and also because of Olivia, right, we know that in 1534, the entire text of the, of the vernacular Bible was going to be translated into German by Martin Luther. But in 1522, the New Testament is going to be issued in German by Martin Luther, right? So, which is absolutely amazing that you guys looked that stuff up. And that year, the significance of the years of like 1517 to 1525 are a very, very important set of years. And it's only 8 years of time, right? So it's important to understand that that little cosmic entity in and of itself is going to be majorly important here in a second. Now, also appeal to Protestant thought, particularly for the nobles, right? You're going to see that clergy are going to be encouraged to pay taxes. This is going to be massively important. And then also pictures of the printing press, right? So not pictures of the printing press, but remember when we talked about Albrecht Dürer and the Northern Renaissance, and he had his works Melancholia I and the Rhino and Night, Death, and the Devil, right? Those were all engravings. And the way you make an engraving, of course, is you use like acid dip pens and chisels to work out the negative on a wood block, and then you paint, or then over top of it, you dab that with ink, and you use it to make pictures inside of books. So these vernacular Bibles were also the very, very first Bibles to be printed with pictures. So this made them even easier for the poorer, less literate populations of Europe to actually understand. Now, it also added imagery to the text that they were going to be reading, right? So also here's another really big one. You should definitely put a star down next to this thing. The Protestant work ethic, right? The Protestant work ethic helped a lot of this like Protestant thought and faith appeal to both the poor and the nobility, because the concept of the Protestant work ethic was that the amount of wealth and land and riches and goods that one person actually had in their possession was a product of your hard work and a reward from God, right? So basically this idea in Protestant thought was that the harder you work, the better off your life will be, right? And this could be seen in like the Dutch Golden Age when they convert to Protestantism. They are heavy users of the Protestant work ethic. This could be used in another like event that we're going to be bringing up here in a moment when we talk about the German Peasants Rebellion, right? So you can see how kind of both negative and positive this idea was used, right? Now, next thing we're getting into, though, is, of course, the Protestant ideas on marriage and sexuality, right? Now, more like marriage and gender, less on sexuality, right? So most Protestants believe, another big appeal of a lot of this Protestant thought is that most of them believe that vows of celibacy that priests were taking in the Catholic Church went against human nature, right? Because in the Bible it says to go off and be fruitful, right? To go off and multiply. And Protestant pastors are going to start getting married. And the guy that sets the tone for this is Martin Luther in 1525, right? In 1525, he gets married to a former nun, okay? And when they get married, this sets a tone for the entire Protestant faith that pastors are allowed to go off and get married, and it is condoned for pastors to actually function as a family unit, which is going to be a big thing that attracts a lot of priests as well to the Protestant faith, right? So the big problem, though, with like Protestantism is you're hoping, not big problem with Protestantism, the only hypocritical thing about all this is that apparently you would think that this would imply that women are going to have maybe some more rights in Protestant communities. And initially you would be correct, because according to some of Martin Luther's early writings, he actually advocated for women being able to own the property that their husband accrued should something happen to him, and actually be a part of like the household property themselves. So like that's a big deal. But then on the flip side, he said that women, though, however, were not equal in society, right? So this is a really, really messed up thing, and it's kind of a hypocritical stance, because it's like now you're allowing these people to go off and get married, but you're still taking this really age-old, disgusting view of women that all of Europe has done for hundreds of years now. It's like you're hoping for some progression, but it still just keeps going like, eh. Like Isabella d'Este just like set the tone for like all Protestant, or not Protestant, but for all women in the post-Renaissance period of Europe, right? The first lady of the Renaissance, Christine de Pizan, right? Like, if y'all remember who those two people are, you're going to kill this AP test when it comes up. Now, Protestants are also going to preach this idea that marriage was a resistance to the lust of society, right? Again, trying to add fuel and reason to why priests were going to be allowed to get married, right? So Protestants, however, like we were just talking about, still believed that women were subordinate, right? However, they did like support, many women are going to support Protestantism despite these beliefs, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that they weren't going to be forced to be nuns, and also a lot of it has to do with the fact that they originally, in some of Martin Luther's writings, they were going to have some property rights, right? So, oh, there it is. God, I've been working on that one for a little while. Now, anyway, so also though, big thing about Protestant faith is they are going to condone divorce / annulments and remarriage, all right? Which is very important when we actually get to a very other important leader that we're going to talk about here very, very soon. Because, of course, he's going to end up converting to Protestantism when his marriage annulment is denied, right? So, but going forward, though, now we're getting into the stuff that I want to talk about. So, Luther's ideas, all right? Luther's ideas were so progressive. And the Protestant thought pattern was so progressive. Like, you're now including women that can actually have property rights. You're actually including pictures in the Bible. You're including vernacular Bibles. You're doing this. You're doing that. So, like, the idea of Protestantism began to grow so heavily that it appealed to so many that German princes in the Holy Roman Empire actually hid him and protected him following the Diet of Worms, right, and following the Edict of Worms that declared him an outlaw, right? And the group of where are they at? The group of like German princes that actually held him and kept him safe was called the Schmicaldic League. Like I can proficiently speak German, but that's a hard word to say. The Schmicaldic League is going to be the league of German princes that actually keeps Luther safe and actually protects him during the growth of Protestantism. One of them actually is one of the guys that Charles V's family had to bribe. I think it's like Francis the Honest or something like that, had to bribe to get into becoming the Holy Roman Empire. He's one of the 7 electors, right? So like this whole idea that like these princes in Germany are going to appeal to Protestant thought, and they're like, boom, we're taking Protestantism, let's go. And this could be due to a lot of different reasons, right? This could be due to several different reasons. Some of the reasons including could be the fact that like, oh, well maybe they want to go because they genuinely believe in Protestant thought. Maybe. Oh, maybe they want to go because they genuinely believe that Luther is being persecuted. Maybe. I tend to side with the third and the biggest reason. I think they saw this as an attempt to try and check Charles's power, right? And to try and exert more power over their lands, okay? So the Schmicaldic League is going to be the people that protect him, right? But then the Schmicaldic League is going to have their first big challenge, okay? So you now have created a system where you're hiding Luther, you're progressing Protestantism, you're trying to check the power of the Holy Roman Emperor, and the fact that you didn't think that these ideas were going to leak into the peasantry is the stupidest thing that you could have possibly done, right? So just to understand and wrap your head around this, is you're going to see a massive set of peasant wars break out, right? Not as in these peasants versus these peasants. I know when you're thinking about this in the back of your mind, you're like, wait, are we talking about like formerly Catholic peasants and now Catholic peasants are disagreeing with each other and they're fighting one another? No. You're going to see the German Peasants' Rebellion, which rises up in 1525, right? The same year that Martin Luther got married, 8 years after he posted the 95 Theses to the door of the church, which he actually probably did, it was probably just a letter that he sent to an archbishop. But anyway, now, 8 years after this, in 1525, the German Peasants' Rebellion occurs. And it was all started by this guy named Little Jack, right? Little Jack is a leader of a large group of peasants inside of the Holy Roman Empire, and he is looking out upon the other peasants, and he's like, man, our crops are failing right now. This year we are having terrible crop yields, but for some reason our rents are rising, right? So, and they live within the Holy Roman Empire, in one of the German-speaking provinces of the Holy Roman Empire, out towards where you would imagine Prussia or Brandenburg is now. So anyway, well, Prussia doesn't exist anymore, but you understand what I'm saying. Now, but the big thing about it, so Little Jack looks at his people, he's like, how can they do this to us? How can they sit there and like raise our rents, and then they know that we don't have enough food, and they're basically letting us starve, but doesn't everything in this newfangled religion that they've adopted say that we're all equal, right? Doesn't it say that no human is inherently better than I am, right? Doesn't it not say that like necessarily no priest or leader or king or anyone is above me in this Protestant thought? I can see some people's like light bulbs starting to click on. I can see Carson going, wait a minute. And I can see Grace going, wait a second. And it's like, yeah, that's right? Like a big thing about the Protestant thought is that no human being is above any other one in the eyes of God, right? So these peasants are furious, and they're like, why do you, the wealthy, get to charge me more rent when you can afford to let me live here for free for a year while the crops are failing? You're not being honest. You're not being fair. You're being dishonest, if anything, right? And Luther, originally, right before the violence begins, comes out in support of them, and he's like, we should be looking after our fellow man. We should be embracing them and helping them out. But when violence started, and the peasants started getting so angry that they started recruiting an army, and a rebellion broke out, and these peasants start literally running in, sacking, taking over, and destroying cities. He goes, oh no, we should kill them like they're dogs in the street. That is an actual quote of Martin Luther. Kill them like dogs in the street, right? So Luther originally supported this rebellion, but then took it back and recanted it fully. I'm going to attach a link in the description below this, and it's John Green's Crash Course European History on the Reformation, and his discussion on the adoption of this entire German Peasants' Rebellion in general is very, very good, right? And it's like very, very solid. But these peasants, the most amazing thing about it is Little Jack and some of his followers are going to cite Scripture as saying, no, we have the right to take back things that are owed to us because none of you are actually better. Because look in this Bible right now, because Scripture alone, sola scriptura, like look at this Bible and you tell me in this where it says serfdom is allowed. You tell me in this where it says the peasantry is immediately below the nobility in all forms and fashions. So the peasants are literally doing what they were told to be done by Luther himself, and yet Luther is coming out against him, right? And so what's going to end up happening, though, is the German Schmicaldic League crushes this rebellion, right? Now, this is not to sit there and say that the peasants didn't have major victories. They did. They actually took over several large cities. At one point, they killed like a huge number of noble people, so they did some nasty stuff as well. But the numbers are so lopsided, right? 75,000 German peasants were killed, and the nobles crushed the rebellion. The Schmicaldic League, which was founded to protect Protestantism and watch it grow, just saw it grow into their peasants, and then their peasants freaked out because, of course, the Schmicaldic nobles weren't doing the right thing, and it blew up in their face, right? So this is an interesting little event in the growth of Protestantism to try and show you that this was not an easy growth, right? That this was not a simple growth, that this was a very major event because people were preaching this idea more than likely for power when they didn't realize that it was going to affect the peasantry class as well. And so this like massive thing ends up happening. And then guess what ends up happening to Little Jack? little Jack ends up getting burned alive at the stake, right? Literally. Not that. Well, that's Jack from like Nightmare Before Christmas. But this right here is little Jack. What's his last name? Rorbin or something like that. Now, the big thing about it, though, is he ends up being burnt at the stake alive in this fashion, bound to iron chains inside of a ring of fire to try and punish him for his German Peasants rebellion that he actually led. Now, the big thing about this, though, that is very important to understand as well, is I'm sure a couple of y'all are looking at this like Malaya or Gia, and you're like, man, this is really messed up because I feel like I side with these peasants. I really, really feel like they're right. They cited scripture. They did what they were told. These nobles are being unkind. And you're right. They were being unkind. And you're right. I side with them as well. I side with these German peasants every single time. And I believe that they were being wronged heavily. But really, really quick, just so you know, peasant rebellions aren't a new thing. All right, so like they're not a new thing at all, okay? So this is a really interesting perspective that I like to teach you that the AP standards tell me that I'm not even supposed to, but whatever. So, like peasant rebellions have been occurring post-establishment of feudalism for hundreds of years, right? Like this is not a new thing. Now that the Protestant faith was growing, you now are just seeing the peasants have more justification for a rebellion against the nobility and against these Schmicaldic princes, right? So this one is another really big one, and this is Georgi Doza, and he is actually a peasant rebellion leader in Hungary in 1517, the year that Martin Luther posted the 95 Theses. So these people are all Catholic in this peasant rebellion, right? And it's a very gruesome story, and do me a favor, jot a little note down and be like, hey, Mr. Terry, you were supposed to tell us about that Hungarian Peasants' Revolt 1517 before the German one, and I'm going to like explain it a little bit better, and I'm going to tell you how this guy, Georgi Doza, ended up dying, and it is one of the most gruesome things you've ever heard in your life, right? So, now, really, really quick, though, you don't need to worry about this. Don't worry about, like, well, actually, yeah, do worry about this. All right, so anyway, now, what we're going to see now occurring as well is we're going to see, like, new Protestant sects begin to pop up, okay? So whenever we're looking at the growth of Protestant faith, you can always look at it as kind of like a spectrum, kind of almost like a political spectrum, right? So, for example, we have this little spectrum right here, right? And we have certain people that are a little bit more towards the middle, that are like super relaxed, and we'll call this like the Catholic faith, even though they were super corrupt. And then we've got Luther's ideas over here, right? Actually, we should probably switch these two around. Let's switch these two around. So we'll go Catholic faith right here, right? And then we had Luther and his ideas popping up. And then we had like Zwingli and his ideas right here, okay? Now, when we're looking at the faiths on this spectrum that we have right here, and this spectrum will continue to grow and advance this way, and we'll get the Anglicans, and then we'll get the Calvinists, and we'll get the Puritans, and we'll get all these other people, right? But starting out in the earliest phases of the Protestant Reformation, around 1525 going into the 1530s, you had the Catholics, right? And the Catholics, of course, are going to continue to just be what they've always been, the Catholic faith, right? Then you had Luther and his ideas come up. And his ideas are going to foster these people known as Lutherans, right? So we're going to see the growth of a Protestant faith of people known as Lutherans, right? So Lutherans, of course, are going to have these new ideas. They're going to believe in like faith alone, grace alone, scripture alone, et cetera, right? But then you have Zwingli. Now, a lot of people are always asking, like, well, if Luther started Lutheranism and Calvin started Calvinism and Henry VIII started Anglicanism, then what the heck did Zwingli start, right? He had his own ideas. He didn't agree with everything Luther said. So definitely a sect of, like, reformative Christians are going to pop up underneath him as well and his ideas, right? Right? Yes, they are, Cassidy. Good job, right? You're just so smart, all right? And what's going to happen here are known as the radical reformers, all right? And I don't mean like Ninja Turtles, like, oh, radical, but I mean particularly a very intense form of reforming government, or not reforming governments, but Reformation-minded sects are going to start to pop up. And the big one is called the Anabaptists, right? So now, going forward, you're going to start to realize that Zwingli, even though he doesn't live for very long, we're going to talk about in a minute how he kind of ends up dying in a very, very sudden fashion during like some wars that broke out in Switzerland, you're going to notice that like his ideas, though, are going to endure, right? And so the radicals are going to be the ones that break the church with secular authorities, right? So the radical reformers, the guys that are going to pick up the ideas of Zwingli, are going to believe that literally the church should be a completely separate thing from the state and should be under no qualms to actually adjust to any law made by any state, right? So with this, you're going to see a bunch of people pop up, right? Some of the radical reformers include mostly the Anabaptists, right? And the Anabaptists are then going to have like little modern day iterations of them, right? So did the Mennonites pop up during the Reformation? No, but they're a form hearkening back to the Anabaptists, right? And the Anabaptists had two really, really big things that kind of made them stand out a lot. But the biggest one, the Anabaptists believe that one, the church owes no, or like you owe no money to that church, and the church is there for the service of man, not necessarily you for the service of the church, right? So this is going to make a lot of Catholic like kings and a lot of Catholic reform or Catholic priests very, very upset, right? And then Luther and his guys are like, yeah, you tell them, right? But then they turn around and look at Luther and they're like, no, we don't agree with you either, because we actually don't believe that children should be baptized. We believe that no man can make a covenant with God. They have to be adults to do that. Right? And so Luther's like, what? And so literally the Anabaptists believe that they should have their second baptism, right? Now, they're also going to have some other iterations, some other major things, like they believe in like catching the Spirit and speaking in tongues and stuff like that. But the radical reformers, particularly the Anabaptists, are going to be heavily persecuted, right? Heavily, heavily persecuted. Some of them are going to end up dying in fashions like this, where they would be tied to ladders and then pushed into fires, right? Some of the other Anabaptists are going to be like this and burned at the stake. And this is a man in a French county removing Anabaptists that have been burned at the stake, being actually preparing it to burn other people, right? So the Anabaptists also at one point were threatened by a king of France, I think it was Francis I, that said, oh, you want to talk about how to cure Anabaptism? You give them their third baptism, which means drowning them, right? Like, so like how screwed up is that? But the Anabaptists are going to be heavily persecuted. And they kind of start this trend of Protestant reformers that are popping up that are going to be heavily, heavily, heavily subjugated, right? Now, other subgroups that are going to pop up as well later on are going to be Quakers, Baptists that are going to pop up in more the North American area. Quakers are going to be monumentally effective because they're actually going to include women in preaching. And Quakers also look at everything differently. They're completely nonviolent, right? So, like, you're seeing, like, some of these new little sects pop up, right? It was kind of like what we were talking about, how originally this is what happened, right? That, like, this was the faith, right? This was the church. Then we had, like, a mitosis moment, and it turned into this and this, right? And then this cell just went and just, like, started popping up all over the place. The Protestant sects are going to see major growth and major, major denominations pop up after them, right? The Anabaptists are an important one to know because the Anabaptists are the products of Zwingli himself, right, and his ideas. So we got one more slide going, and then we're going to, like, wrap it up, right? So the big thing about it, though, going forward, is you're going to see also a lot of huge religious wars and battles kind of popping up, right? Now, one of the most important ones is this thing called the Schmicaldic Wars, of course, going to be fought by, guess who? Your Schmicaldic princes, right? Now, a series of small wars begin to pop up, because these Schmicaldic princes begin to cling to Luther's ideas, right? Some of them like it for the faith. I believe, again, many of them like it for the legal abuse of power, right? Because they feel that they can literally tell Charles that he doesn't get to tell them what to do anymore because they're not even the same faith, right? And so Charles V is going to become a fervent defender of Catholicism. And so what you're going to see pop up are these small wars that are going to break out in Switzerland, inside the Holy Roman Empire by Charles, and then, like, actually going after Swiss Anabaptists and German Lutherans, right? So these wars are oftentimes referred to as the Schmicaldic Wars, right? So the Schmicaldic Wars are going to be when Charles actually assembles an army directed by the Pope and to actually go out and destroy these, like, German princes, their militaries, and try to force an end with authority to the growth of Protestantism, right? And so with this, though, these small wars did begin to erupt, and there was Protestant versus Catholic. Zwingli is actually going to die in a battle in 1531, and he dies on the field of war when one of these things breaks out, right? So, like, interestingly enough, though, Charles, write this down, though, like somewhere on the side, like a little star somewhere, whatever, Charles had already been fighting years of war before this, right? So he just got done fighting a war against the Valois of France, right? Because he's a Habsburg that lives in the Holy Roman Empire, and he hates the Valois of France. And I'm going to have these names up there in about 2 seconds. But the big thing about it is Charles had been fighting war for years, right? He was already at war. And so when these Schmicaldic Wars broke out, and he's trying to forcefully end Lutheranism, He realizes that his funds are drying up, his military forces are dying out, and he has to find a way to stop all this violence, or else he's going to lose complete control of the empire that he has tried to build, right? And I believe, you can jot this down, the Schmicaldic Wars ended in about 1547. I got to check the date of something else really quick. Charles V abdicates. What did he have? I think it was 1548, 1556. Yeah, so, and then the Peace of Augsburg. Nice. All right, so yeah, and I believe the Schmicaldic Wars ended around 1547. Let me double check that too. Schmicaldic War. So 1547. Yeah, I was right. All right. So anyway, now, so during the Schmicaldic War, during the Habsburg-Valois War, during all this other stuff going on, Charles realizes that he's got to find a way to end religious division, right? And when he figures out finally how he's going to do this, he decides the only way to make all these wars and this violence stop, because he's also going mentally insane, right? It's 1547 when the Schmicaldic War ends. Most of his army is depleted. He's now got also issues going on in the North American colonies because the encomienda's killing all the Native Americans. So he's got to start the slave trade. He's got all these issues going on everywhere because he controls 25% of the world, right? So to end religious division, he decides to create a diet, right? And a diet, and I don't mean a diet like what he's eating, but he calls an imperial diet. So the diet of Worms is called a diet because a diet is a meeting, right? It's like a meeting of people. So this was an imperial diet, and he tells Lutheran leaders, because I believe by this point in 1554, I believe Luther was already dead. Luther, death. And then, yeah, because he died in 1546. Luther actually died right when the Schmicaldic Wars started. But Charles V, following the death of Luther, calls the Lutheran and Protestant leaders, and he says, do me a favor, I want you to outline your beliefs. And they did. They actually outlined them in a document called the Augsburg Confession, where they outlined everything they believed, and it is still considered the preeminent statement of faith by the Lutheran Church, right? It is still considered the outline of their faith. And to cease military alliances and wars, to try and bring peace to the Holy Roman Empire before it falls apart completely, he creates this thing called the Peace of Augsburg, right? And at the Peace of Augsburg, oh, nice. Heck yeah. You see, that is so important. I never realized that was right there. So, and at the Peace of Augsburg, he decides to recognize Luther and Lutherans as a legitimate faith, right? So this is why I believe Charles V gets a bad rap. I think Charles V is not a bad king. I think he bent when he didn't have to. He could have just listened to the Pope and crushed this thing and killed lots of people, but he decided that it wasn't worth it, right? And so in 1555, the Peace of Augsburg is going to be created, where he literally ceases military actions, and it's basically a peace treaty allowing Lutherans to be a legitimate faith inside of the Holy Roman Empire, right? And at the Peace of Augsburg, this right here is very important. One of the reasons why he did this and how he pulled this off is he told these Schmicaldic princes, he was like, look, whatever faith you are, that is the faith of your people, all right? Because remember, the Holy Roman Empire is all these little provinces, and each province is led by a prince, right? And there are 7 electors in the Holy Roman Empire that are like the Holy Roman Emperor, right? Who's supposed to lead over all the princes. But the princes were trying to abuse their power by trying to convert to Lutheranism to try and say to Charles, we don't want to listen to you, right? So Charles concedes to them, right? And he says, you can be Lutheran, fine. Follow your little Augsburg Confession, be Lutheran, I don't care. But do me a favor, and just whatever you are, that's what your people need to be, right? So, whatever you are, whatever you decide to be, that is what your people are. If you are Lutheran, your people are Lutheran in your province. If you're Catholic, your people are Catholic in your province. And just leave me alone. And he literally gets so mentally anguished by this that at the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, that next year in 1556 is the year that Charles abdicates, right? He abdicates the throne, he splits the Habsburg family in half, and he gives half of the family and all of its holdings to Philip II, his son, and he gives the other half of it to his brother, all right? So, but you can jot that down really quick, gives it to Philip II and his son, and all of this fighting would eventually lead to the 30 Years' War later on, which is going to be one of the biggest massacres that Europe has ever seen, all right? Because this Band-Aid right here, this Peace of Augsburg, was a temporary fix. It is a Band-Aid. There is a festering wound underneath it, and the Peace of Augsburg was just enough so he could go smack, and then so he could peace out, right? So, but now, starting tomorrow, we're going to start talking about our big, goofy-looking friend right here. Can't wait. I'll see you guys then. Y'all have a good one.